ethical implications of AI technologies, and especially their deployment, both in general and also specifically in data science and computer security. We have four lovely panelists from a variety of backgrounds here to discuss the topic with us. Catherine is a hacker mama, scholar, and artist who focuses on feminist technology, data literacy, and civic engagement. She wrote a 2020 book called Data Feminism, co-authored with Lauren Klein, where she charts a course for more ethical and empowering data science practices. Catherine is an assistant professor of urban science and planning at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, where she's also the director of their Data Plus Feminism Lab. Ram is a data cowboy within the Azure Trustworthy ML team at Microsoft, working on the intersection of machine learning and security. His team's goal is to empower engineers to develop and deploy ML systems securely. Ram is also an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University, where he explores the societal implications of adversarial AI. Aylin is an assistant professor of computer science at George Washington University and at the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics. She is interested in AI ethics, bias in AI, machine learning, and the implications of machine learning on privacy, security, fairness, and society. Much of her research is on methods to interpret AI and gain insight into the bias in both artificial and natural intelligence. And she has worked to demonstrate how human-like biases can crop up in natural language analysis due to the statistical regularities of language. And finally, Anima is the Bren Professor at Caltech and the Director of ML Research at NVIDIA. She was previously a Principal Scientist at Amazon Web Services. She's received several honors, such as the Alfred P. Sloan Fellowship, NSF Career Award, Young Investigator Awards from DoD, and several more. She is part of the World Economic Forum's expert network and is passionate about designing principled AI algorithms and applying them to interdisciplinary outcomes. She has been outspoken on AI bias and the need for democratization and focuses her research on unsupervised AI, optimization, and tensor methods. They are all wonderful people, and I can personally vouch for the fact that they do super cool research, and I'm more than thrilled to talk with them all. So to kind of get us started, there's been a lot of conversation, at least recently, about AI bias and misuse of AI in the news in the United States recently. A lot of tech companies have talked about how they're gonna stop using facial recognition algorithms or stop providing them to police to use. And there's also been a lot of conversation both in the academic literature and also in the national news media about biased AI, AIs that learn to be racist because they look at racist data, or learn to be sexist because they look at sexist data. But AI ethics is kind of a much broader topic than that. So to kick us off, can each of you say a little bit about what the scope of the field is to you and how it relates to the work that you do? Ram, why don't you give us a start?
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm not an AI ethics expert. I'm so glad that Anima, Catherine, Aylin are here along with Stella. So you should be getting solid, stellar advice from them. So whatever I'm going to talk is through my lived experience and interacting with folks like Kendra Albert, Jonathan Penny from Berkman, and along with Mary Gray and a whole host of other folks. So that's my preface for this. So for me, I've been looking at Berkman at the, what is adversarial ML? How does that impact the experience of citizenship? So one of the things that for me, how we've been interpreting this topic is moving away from just the constraint of ethics and thinking about power structures, especially in the context of adversarial machine learning. So turns out that machine learning is political in the Langdon winner sense, and security has a lot of implications, if you think of the moral character of cryptography by Rogaway, and adversarial machine learning, which is what I work on as a researcher, sits in the intersection of these two topics. So thinking through who is securing the ML systems? What is securing? Who are we securing it against? Who is the attacker? Is the attacker just like anybody who compromises the confidentiality, integrity, and availability? So those are kind of the broader questions that I'm looking at Berkman.
All right, Aylin?
Stella, thank you for the introduction, and I'm very excited to be part of this amazing panel so that I will get to hear all of your ideas and vision on this topic. My research focuses on, as you mentioned, AI ethics and especially bias nowadays. About a decade ago, I started working on the implications of machine learning on privacy and security, since machine learning or AI technologies are double-edged swords. When they have security enhancing properties, they usually end up infringing upon our privacy. And starting from there, I started slowly seeing the link between privacy and fairness, and how when our data is exploited, abused, or collected by third parties, it can lead to fairness concerns at the group level. And nowadays, I'm focusing on understanding how AI systems learn bias, or essentially how systems can learn some form of intelligence or learning ability, and how that relates to bias in both natural and artificial intelligence. And when we looked at natural language systems, for example, word embeddings or today's neural language models that can generate text that is almost human level, we see that these systems are learning human-like biases from society very accurately, especially when compared to validated social psychological methods such as the implicit association test. And then these systems are deployed at the world scale, impacting billions of people every single day with their consequential decisions or biased outputs. And this ends up turning into this AI bias life cycle, which is also a feedback cycle of AI ethics as well. And I'm interested in understanding all of the components in this AI ethics life cycle, the role humans play in this life cycle, how we can discover biases or harmful side effects of these AI systems, and what we can do to mitigate these harmful effects and prepare for upcoming problems that might have already been caused by AI systems. And during today's panel, we will go into the details of all of these single components, starting from the most technical atomic details of machine learning, going up to probably some philosophical questions at the high level abstraction.
Thank you, Aylin. Anima?
Yeah, I completely agree with Aylin and Ram. It's to me exciting times to be an AI researcher, but also, right, I'm filled with dread at where the world is moving and how fast we are, moving in directions that I find problematic. And to me, the source of it all comes to the foundations under which this deep learning revolution is built on. Right. So I'd like to emphasize when I'm giving talks on AI about this trinity, the data, algorithms, and computer infrastructure coming together. And that's what allowed us to have this fast progress in deep learning. But most of that progress has been with supervised learning, right? The availability of large-scale labeled data starting from the ImageNet dataset was the start of this revolution. And in a way, that is quite straightforward. Once you know that you want to optimize for accuracy and you have the labeled data, you can kind of quickly build these systems. But the problem is sometimes we want not just the accuracy, but like robustness, right? Like what Ram was saying, what are the different changes beyond the training data? And when our training data is biased, how does this affect on minority populations that are not represented in training data? And part of it is not just the data imbalance, but also the algorithmic bias. If you're on Twitter like me, and if you follow the Twitter storm on the presence of algorithmic bias on deep learning, you know what I'm talking about. So, and just to the gist of it, the idea is, I think some proponents of deep learning do not want anything negative being said around deep learning. But I do think these very large-scale models, highly nonlinear models, are the source of the problem. because the more nonlinear it gets, the more brittle they are, the more they amplify the bias, right? There is no free lunch. You cannot have it all in one mechanism unless we are thoughtful in terms of the objectives we build in, the kind of data we use, and also the kind of testing we do. And so what I work on is unsupervised learning. And I think, to me, this is the core for us to move away from these highly biased models. To take a simple example, even before the deep learning revolution, I was working on topic models, right, where we wanted to categorize large corpus of documents, and there's no label data. And so now with these unsupervised learning, we are suggesting these are possible topics, right? And these are the words representing the topics. And then it's up to the human to interpret and judge what are relevant topics. Because there are weird correlations in text, so there can be lots of topics that are not human interpretable. And so human in the loop with unsupervised learning, I think, is the key to get out of this place where we are stuck with biased models. And the current revolution now is unsupervised. Now we're seeing a lot of progress in self-supervised learning and robustness. Hopefully that'll lead us the way forward. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And finally, Catherine, where are you coming from with this?
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks, Stella, for the invitation. It's a super pleasure to be here with you all. Yeah, so I guess where I'm coming from is not as much of a focus on AI, although some of the things that we say, many of the things we say in our book, Data Feminism, apply, but we sort of enlarge the scope more broadly to be data writ large. And thinking about also, one of the things that's happened as this conversation has grown around fairness, accountability, transparency, bias, ethics, and so on, there's been a lot of pushback on just like AI and data are great, they're working great for everybody. And our contribution with data feminism is to say, hey, actually, feminism as a kind of body of knowledge, as a kind of intellectual heritage, which has theorized, philosophized, and also done a lot of writing and sort of action, like social movements, action around the topic of inequality, has a lot to offer us in terms of conceptual models for how we can think about this current state of affairs. And so that was sort of the premise of data feminism, is to say, hey, let's look over here at feminism. What can we bring from feminism to understand how we might work with data science in a more ethical way? And specifically taking structural inequality, which is basically like power differences between social groups, as kind of our main locus of attention. And so when you look at that and you look at things like, and one of the things I guess that was irritating, I guess I'll say, as we were writing the book, which I'm sure folks here are also irritated by, is that often, when we have a biased, whatever, algorithm or something like this, like a resume screener, let's say, that is favoring men over women, the media reports on it with this thing of like surprise, like, oh my gosh, like how could this be possible? Like how could there be bias in a machine? And we're like, oh my gosh, like feminism has so much to say about this. And so ultimately, like what the book does is it kind of backs us up. It's in a way less in the details. It's not providing you with a way of like systematically fixing your data set or anything like that, but it backs us up like way further back in the processing pipeline to say, well, like, here's why these things surface. They surface because of hundreds of years of inequality. They surface because of really flawed models of people like women not being considered fully human, or people of color not being considered fully human. And to really take, if we aspire to build something that is ethical, we have to look and we have to undertake that with a different kind of time horizon. And that has to be built into everything that we do. So we're trying to kind of both say like, hey, let's look back at the root causes. What causes structural inequality? Like, why do we end up with biased, crime data sets in the first place, before we start trying to like fix them or something? And then how do we use that information to decide which problems do we work on? who do we work with, who do we want to benefit with our work, and who do we want to just like refuse to work with entirely, because there are some really bad actors out there. And so that's, and then we talk a lot about democratizing data literacy, and AI as well, because that I think is really part of the key of how we're gonna get through this. So we're trying to balance being not only doom and gloom with like, how do we move forward? And we propose a set of 7 principles for how we move forward with a kind of feminist approach to data science.
Great, thank you. So I think a common thread in what all of y'all said is that there are problems, the problems in machine learning exist both in the pipeline process, where the data is coming from, how it's processed, but also, that isn't all of the problems. A lot of the time in the media and in conversations, people have this idea that data is like some kind of objective truth, and that when you come up with biased results or incorrect results, it's because the analyst messed up somewhere. So, you know, do you think that's true? Spoiler alert, I'm pretty sure y'all are gonna say no. But, you know, what would you say to someone who thinks that way, and like, what are the problems with thinking about data that way? Whoever wants to kind of get started.
I can quickly start with a positive note. Data certainly reflects state of the society, but it does it in a defective way. So we are not getting a perfect representation of society, especially with regards to minorities, because they are underrepresented. But when we have such data sets, at the same time, one advantage is that we can also study the historical injustices these minorities, underrepresented or disadvantaged groups have been going through, because it's reflected in the data set. And as Stella already mentioned, since these data sets are a reflection of society, and then when we start building models on these systems, then we have data that is reflecting these biases. But at the same time, it also reflects some facts about the world, such as statistical biases, inductive biases, or some kind of facts that can also be useful. But that does not justify the fact that there are all these harmful information that get very accurately embedded in these systems. So this is my double-edged view on this data topic for now.
I can follow up with that. I completely agree with Aylin. I think the problem is how the data on the internet is reflecting the society, but only in very imbalanced ways, right? And this gets amplified when you want large data sets. You know, the latest one in this aspect is the GPT-3. It's trained on links from Reddit. You know, I'm almost never on Reddit. I've only been victim of trolling and gun threats on Reddit. I stay away. I don't know any woman in machine learning that I'm aware of who's active on Reddit.
So I'm gonna let this
so you
sit
can
for a minute,
see
let
that
you guys,
even
go ahead and
among
copy
all the
this down
imbalance in the
correctly.
internet, the Reddit is even further amplified. So the decision to go for Reddit links and claim that's what we want to build the largest language model on, we can spend tens of millions of dollars on this data set and nothing else, is to me extremely disappointing and disheartening that you know, the VCs, the decision makers, they're always going for the worst of the toxic, you know, forms of data that's available on the internet. And I really can't justify this. I don't know how they sleep every night. I don't know how they can say with a straight face that this is the path towards AGI. I mean, this is nonsense, right? So I get frustrated all the time. I know Aylin was trying to paint a more positive picture. I'm just extremely disillusioned, and I'm sorry for being open about that.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll pop in on the negative note. What happens that I think we're pointing to here is that data are very resource intensive, right? And so it's only certain actors, this is something we say in the book, it's only certain actors in the world that have the resources to collect, store, maintain, utilize, analyze, deploy in some product or whatever, these kinds of data. And so at root, you only have certain actors in the world that are able to actually do that work. And because data are so expensive, we see all these kinds of shortcuts, like exactly like this, where it's like, oh, like where can we get a big data set? Okay, Reddit. Or like, oh, where can we get images to train image, face recognition algorithm? Oh, okay, like celebrity faces or whatever. And just like not connecting the dots of, again, like in what ways, like who is not represented in those data sets. And there's like all these multiple points of kind of where inequality kind of enters that pipeline and like not catching it at any of those points, because then the people that are working with the data are often, they are the white elite non-immigrant men, and they are representative of that demographic that are celebrities, right? And so like, that you have these kind of multiple stages at which those things don't get caught. But I mean, at the root of it, I often think of the constraint in a lot of ways is financial. Like folks are looking for a shortcut.
I mean, I'm so glad, Catherine, you brought the issue of like celebrity data set. So in the news event, you'd have heard about Fox, which is kind of like a cloaking tool, for privacy. It uses like very fundamental techniques in adversarial machine learning so that, people can kind of, like save their privacy from like terrible tools like Clearview AI. And when Kashmiri Hill, kind of like the New York Times reporter, tried it out, it was so weird. She got some really weird photos. And when she asked the PI of that project, like, hey, why are these photos looking really ori? I thought the whole point is to keep the face same in the cloaked picture. And he said something to the effect, and I'm perhaps going to misquote him. He said, "Oh yeah, women get mustaches, and like men get eyelashes. That's how you kind of like cloak. That's kind of like an outcome." I'm sure there's a whole like semester of SDS gender studies to unpack there, because they use like celebrity faces, and like how many transgenders are represented in like celebrity data sets. My first thought was, have you seen the winner of Eurovision 2019? Like, shame on you. Have you seen like RuPaul's Drag Race? Shame on you. But yeah, it is. And I'm so sorry, Aylin, that we're not like raining on your parade. But even though somebody starts with really good intent, and I'm sure like the Fox team did it with very good intent of like, I am going to forward privacy. I'm going to like empower people. But like you said, like when they don't connect the dots, or like how Anima said, when they take like shortcuts, it doesn't lead to less than like harmful outcomes.
So just as a quick reminder for the people listening along, Fox is the paper that we discussed yesterday at Journal Club. So if you were there for that, awesome. If not, you can read about the paper. You can listen to me and a couple others talk about the paper Ram's talking about on our YouTube channel, where it should be up by now. Sorry, Aylin, did I cut you off?
I saved my pessimistic comments to the end. The topic.
We could circle back.
Exactly. Now we have our feedback loop completed. So I'm really curious about all the data practices that are going on out there, or the data in practices or abuse, because as I said, I'm coming from a privacy background, and how people's data is abused so that they can be de-anonymized, they can be tracked, and essentially entities that hold power can use this for surveillance or for large-scale manipulation. And unfortunately, as citizens or as human beings living in the world, we don't consent to our data being collected, but we don't have an option to opt out. So all of our data, under the premise of free applications, free products, or just walking on the streets in country X, is being collected by these entities that hold power to build large databases of any kind of information. And in some cases, this data is not being even used because they think that we don't have a way to use it right now, but in the future, we will figure out a way to make use of this data to make one type of consequential decision again. And this is extremely problematic because the citizen is not informed about these practices and what the long-term effects might be on individuals and society. And on the other hand, when we look at other power holders, such as proprietary software or all companies that are providing these services for the entire world that are free, supposedly free, are making so much money because they are making use of the data that we are providing them. And after that, they keep building stronger machine learning models so that they can keep amplifying these biases in their direction with their targeted ads or whatever their incentive is. And here there is a serious problem about the incentives of these systems. And both Catherine and Anima mentioned that, for example, we have these objective functions optimizing for accuracy in these systems that actually are helping these power entities. But the objective function could also be how can we use these data sets for social good as opposed to optimizing for accuracy. So there are so many different faceted and different levels of abstraction of problems involved in this data ecosystem again. And I guess we can keep discussing these in more details, but today the goal is kind of give a glimpse of what is going on in this area.
So, Aylin, you picked out, yes, Ram?
Oh, sorry. I just have like a quick follow-up for Aylin and Anima. I know that both of you have kind of revealed the shortcomings of like ML systems. Anima, you've done like extremely awesome work about how GPT-3 is flawed, and Aylin, your like groundbreaking work on word embeddings. When you and I know that both of you have communicated that research to the community in a very approachable fashion, but I don't know about you, Aylin, but I visibly see the kind of like negative, rancorous feedback that you get. And from very well-intentioned research, I mean, I don't know well-intentioned, from like people who are in the ML community, why do you think that happens? Like, and Catherine, like from a feminist perspective, why are people from the own educated community like unloading on these researchers? I would love to get your perspectives on this. Sorry, Stella, I didn't mean to like.
No, that's fine. That's very close to where I was going to go anyway. So,
Yeah.
I mean, just maybe I can get started on this, right? I mean, to me, I think it's at the root of human psychology. Like, no one wants to be the bad guy. No one wants to think of themselves as the bad guys. So they believe, right, they are going towards AGI through this GPT-3 model, for instance, right? I mean, I think they truly believe, which is shocking. So let's assume that. And I think the thing is, they really don't want to also hear anything that may harm that, right? So they believe anything that may harm that path are their enemies. People who are voicing opinions against it are their enemies. And so that's why we see this vicious pushback on social media platforms like Twitter, and and then they have huge follower counts, so that builds up, right? And all they have to do is just kind of give their followers sense to go after people who are bringing up these difficult issues. And honestly, because there's also a lot of insecurity, they don't know the answers to this. They don't know a way out, and they worry that their entire existence is in question, which I think that's why, to me, I feel like we are on the right track. So we have to keep pushing this on and increasing awareness, have more allies. I think we will get more support, and it's already been amazing over the last few years, right? I mean, it's happened so quickly. Even just the mention of AI bias was not there. It was completely dismissed in machine learning conferences. People working on it were considered not technical, were not respected. There was a lot of gaslighting, because it happens to be women, it happens to be minorities. So there was even more of all that racism and sexism coming into play when such research was reported. But now, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, that's when these companies finally said, we won't be selling face recognition to law enforcement, right? We've been asking for this, we've signed letters, we've gone to the press, we've been doing this for a while, and it's been led by Black women, which is amazing. But, it took a broader global movement to make this happen. And I think we're building this momentum up because it's not just about AI, it's not just about data ethics. It's a much broader question for humanity. And I think I remain hopeful.
So since Anima brought this up, I wanted to take a moment and ask you guys, do any of you, either as yourselves personally or the companies or institutions that you represent, have any policies about what types of organizations or what types of tasks you will not do ML research or data research for? Be it police applications, military applications are two of the ones I know are really popular. Speaking personally, disclaimer. Sorry, before I say this, my company has a large number of lawyers who'd like me to tell you that my views on the stream represent myself and in no way represent my company at all. I work for a U.S. government contractor, and a lot of the people who work at my company do ML research for the Department of Defense and the U.S. military. And that's a very contentious topic, both within my company and I know within the ML community at large. I have been personally trying to decide how to navigate that line myself. But I was wondering if any of you guys had particular stances you've developed.
I'll just say for my own work, and I'm not speaking about MIT, because obviously MIT is all wound up with all sorts of different things. But at least, as a professor, you have autonomy to do what you want. And so at least from my perspective, I've decided to only work with folks who are doing some kind of counter-hegemonic work. So activists, journalists, social movements, community-based organizations. That's also kind of that's also in my research interest, is to think about both how do we think about building data literacy in those kinds of sectors as well. So it's a really nice fit, and that happens to be where my interests are. But I'm sympathetic to the stance that when you work in a large organization, as many of these places are, you have a lot less autonomy in thinking about, how do you navigate that as an individual? How do you navigate that as a team? And how do you navigate that at the level of the institution? But I will say, I am really energized by all of the organizing and activism that's happened within large companies right now as well. And so I think that is a huge, potentially is a huge force for change as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to add what Stella said earlier, right? I am not representing NVIDIA or Caltech for that matter. But I see a lot of support building up from the grassroots in these organizations. And NVIDIA being the platform for AI computing, we are not directly selling these kind of AI applications, right? So it's really our customers and partners. And so there is less of a control in sense of everything the others do, but where there's always periodic reviews and there have been discussions internally in terms of how to make sure that our platforms are being used for good causes rather than bad ones. But I agree there is a lot more work to be done, but I'm very energized by activism internally at NVIDIA and also at Caltech, especially the students, everything, from the recent Black Lives Matter, how it was really the students who have been energizing this movement. And so that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, and I'm happy. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Aylin. Please.
I was just going to say that I'm not representing anyone except my humble opinion that might not be very well formed, but I try to build my own ethical framework when approaching these issues, since we don't have the AI ethics framework that is widely accepted by anyone. I basically try not to work on any confidential project. I haven't worked on any confidential or secret projects. And other than that, I try to get involved in pro bono activities to help companies, entities, research their systems to understand what kind of negative side effects they might have, especially with regards to bias. Can we come up with new forms of ways to measure bias, develop methods? And that has been my approach to this issue right now. But if we had a well accepted code of ethics among researchers, I think everyone would benefit from such a framework.
I mean, I totally agree. I think one of the things that's kind of like helped me personally, again, you know, boilerplate. I'm only representing myself. When Anima said like reviews, that kind of like really resonated with me. There is like within Microsoft, there's this like committee called the AI Ethics and Research Organization. It's called Ether, and you know, I'm perhaps butchering the acronym. But one of the things that they do, and it is like, you know, folks from MSR, you know, and it's just not the ML folks, but MSR is such a vibrant community. So, you know, you've got like sociologists, you know, folks from like who think about bias from MSR New York, in Eric Horowitz's organization, kind of like, you know, making sure for critical like ML applications, you know, you need to get Ether's sign off. So that has been a, you know, a guiding light. The second thing for me is like, you know, I completely agree with Aylin if there's some like a framework, and I, you know, that way you can meet it out to engineers. The thing that's kind of worked for me is that the standards of business conduct at Microsoft is surprisingly good, which is a very weird thing to say, because they make it, they shoot it like Netflix style videos. So it's not some boring training that you have to kind of go through. I mean, I've worked in Microsoft like in 2013, it was just like the most like boring thing, but you still have to do it. It's like if you read through it, but now it's like an actual like Netflix series. They've got the same actors coming in different years. But I mean, long story short, there was a module about how this guy tries to train his model on this like private customer data, and how he gets into so much of, you know, like a big big soup. He can't get out of it. You know, he's trying to demo it and he has to like talk to his manager, and manager's like, oh my gosh, you're gonna like, you know, lose your job. So they really rain it down on you in a more relatable fashion. So all of this to say that, you know, having this you know, this committee to kind of like guide for critical like applications, and kind of having this like relatable you know, ethics discussion has kind of like helped at least me and my team personally a lot, especially because we're working in a cybersecurity team.
I was going to quickly ask Ram, so can they release this to the public? I think everyone can benefit immensely from this as well.
Yeah, I really hope that they do, because it's really captivating. Like, you're not bored, you know, when you're watching that.
So I have a question from the Discord that something you guys have all touched on a little bit, but I think is worth like directly addressing, which is that, so we've been talking about how we all represent large companies or major universities, you know, institutions that have power and money and resources. And, you know, what is, so what the question asked on Discord was, you know, if what's the role that these large institutions, these powerful and franchise institutions play? And, you know, if the ability to collect large data sets or train these very large, expensive models were somehow democratized, would that improve the situation? Ram, I think we should throw this over to you, because I know you've recently written a paper on this topic.
Yeah, that's a really hard question for me, you know, just because, you know, again, from a winner sense, like, is machine learning inherently authoritarian, you know, because like, or is it inherently democratic? And you know, there are arguments to be made on both sides. Like, you know, like Anima started off with data, compute, and the algorithms. That knowledge is kind of centralized in a lot of, you know, in a lot of aspects, right? You know, Google kind of released like one of its models, and it cost like, like $10 million or so with their TPU training pods, which, like a mom and pop shop, like an individual researcher is not going to have. And data, as we all know, like Catherine kind of like outlines in her book beautifully, like how it is really, it's situated with power almost. So, in a Langdon Benner sense, it really does, one may almost say that, machine learning is authoritarian. On the other hand, actually, one of the other papers that we read was Anima's Born Again Neural Nets paper, where she shows that, a student can actually, in certain like conditions, outperform the teacher. And if you think about the revolution that transfer learning is bringing along, a company can put out this like pre-trained model, and then you can just retrain the last layer for your like custom like applications. So, and now with like systems like fast.ai, and like they're bringing like machine learning like to programmers, which again is not making it democratic. So it's almost like you kind of trying to install solar panels in your house, as opposed to like depending on like a nuclear power station. So I completely struggle with this question. I keep vacillating back and forth, and unfortunately, I do not have like I'm not like settled on an answer. And perhaps like other panelists will guide us through this cave.
Thank you, Ram, for bringing up the paper. I think to me, I again pin my hope back on the algorithms, right? So I think we are just at the infancy in terms of algorithmic development for deep learning. We've been using the very basic algorithms. The question is, where to go next? I mentioned unsupervised learning earlier as a broad topic. I think within that, what we want is more controllability, right? Like for instance, generating text. If you could control what needs to be generated, then you can try, head towards removing these biases, at least in what's generated, even if it's inherent in the model. And in fact, that's what we need in practical applications. We don't want it to write weird poetry. We want it to maybe give us knowledge facts, or ultimately program, do program synthesis and so on. And so that's something we've been working on. Same for text, same for images, right? Ultimately, the GAN should be able to have controllable generation, and I can control various attributes, right? And that way, then it's really at the hands of the human on how to use these models. And currently, we don't have good frameworks for that. And I think unsupervised learning is the key to enable that, because you have to learn what are the hidden variations in data, and then how to control and change that and be able to generate new examples. Yeah, so I think that's a direction to go forward.
I completely agree with Anima, by the way. She has been mentioning unsupervised learning. I also think that the future is probably in unsupervised, self-supervised learning that is a bit maybe more intelligent, depends on how you define intelligent, because again, this is semantics and a vague term, but it seems like once we get there, so that the system is able to figure out this universal learning pattern somehow, and then starts figuring out different kind of tests by itself, we might be able to somehow incorporate some kind of awareness to the system. And one option would be a human in the loop, for example. And again, Anima mentioned this a few minutes ago, saying that human psychology and awareness plays a very important role here. Like we are not able to agree on many of these questions, because we are dealing with ethical questions. Everyone has their own understanding, their own answer, and their own desired fairness notion, and we can't satisfy all of these at the same time. However, if we are able to bring some kind of awareness in these systems, then we might be able to change actions and decisions, because For example, to my understanding in social psychology as well, the evolution of how people are reacting to biases depends on how aware we are of our biases. It's not like people are trying to discriminate other groups. It's mostly caused by favoring the in-group. Like there are no harms that are explicitly trying to be imposed upon other groups, but this unintentional bias ends up causing all of these harms. So in an unsupervised way, if we can figure out some kind of an efficient learning pattern where we can also incorporate ethical mechanisms, then we will start getting there. But of course, all of these will require a lot of informed discussions from many different perspectives and many different disciplines as well, because this is affecting all disciplines, all the sciences, and every social fabric.
And yeah, maybe I'll just, I mean, I think the question of, you know, is machine learning authoritarian or not is a super interesting one, but ultimately the way that we would answer it from a feminist perspective is, in whose hands is it? So, you know, so feminism, basically what feminism brings is who questions. So like, who is using it, for whom, to support whom, to oppress whom, and so on. And so, I mean, I think that for me is the, those are the questions to be asking when we're thinking about like democratizing AI. Like, I think it's lovely to think about making easier to use models, democratizing access to data and computational power. Those are all great things as like a kind of infrastructure of democratization, but on their own, they won't create a democratic kind of usage of AI, because we also need to do the bridge to the groups that could really actually benefit from AI. And for me, like again, like I say, like I'm interested in sort of counter-hegemonic groups. So thinking about like, what are groups that actually hold power accountable? They're groups like lawyers and legal scholars, journalists, community organizations, social movements. Like these are the folks who need to be kind of trained and brought to the table if we're actually talking about a comprehensive effort to democratize AI, because those are the folks that you want to understand, like, what are actually the creative potentials. And there are many, like some of the journalists that have started to discover the power of machine learning have been doing amazing things, like detecting, using image recognition to detect amber mining from satellite imagery in the Ukraine, for example. Like you can do this like kind of amazing accountability work, but not every person is going to have that idea because they haven't been exposed to working in this way. So, so yeah.
So if we're talking about, you know, AI algorithms being developed by institutions of power, and the fact that like who is using algorithms matters a lot, is there a role in like adversarial AI? Adversarial AI is usually cast as a bad thing because machine learning engineers do good, and those pesky evildoers are trying to ruin it. But if machine learning algorithms are being used for bad, you know, does that mean that adversarial AI techniques can be used for good?
Oh, I love that.
Totally.
Yeah. Yeah,
I totally think so. Yes, because like there are so many reasons why groups or individuals would need to be protecting themselves, like from, you know, we were just talking about Reddit, for example, you know, like there's so many reasons why, you know, like an act of kind of an adversarial act is not necessarily bad. Like, for example, I have a friend who, as a way of kind of fooling the just rampant data capture that's done by promotional ads and things in the browser. And so like the browser's always sending the IP address and whatnot. And what it does is, instead of like sending what it clicks on, the browser clicks on, it actually just sends every link on the page. It sends it ad services. So it's like hacking it through obfuscation, you know? And so it's like, I think that's a brilliant technique for then preserving privacy. So you're obfuscating what the user's actually doing, and screwing with the ad systems or whatever. And so I think, especially in situations where power is not equal, which is every situation right now, then like we also need like good, like white hat adversarial ML, basically.
I love this, Catherine. I got so excited for the ad blocker research. I mean, Right now, in the field of adversarial machine learning, the use of adversarial machine learning to enhance the experience of citizenship is still nascent. But, there's fantastic work that's happening. I'm so excited for this. Bogdan Kulinic, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing his last name incorrectly, developed this paper called POTS, which is Protective Optimization Techniques, wherein to kind of like empower. So what they do is it's really cool. Turns out that obviously credit card scoring is biased against minority population, and they show like how you can poison the system tactically, like literally launch like a poisoning attack to kind of like make it better for the target population. There's another cool work from some researchers who found that Facebook's ads platform is micro-targeting, and they again use adversarial ML to show like faults in that. So that opens up like exactly like how Catherine says, white hat adversarial examples. Unfortunately, it's not the dominant thinking. In fact, DARPA, when it released its guard challenge, which is securing against like AI challenge, they said we need to protect ML systems from attackers, and they do not define who attackers are. So that's
and I completely agree with Ram and Catherine, and I think there's also because we don't know who are the attackers. I feel like there's also people are going in all kinds of weird directions with adversarial AI research. Because they don't know what kind of attack to, and they're like, okay, maybe I'll do this norm bound or some other, right? And then it's like, okay, why does this matter? We don't know, right? So I think perceptual attacks for images are much more meaningful. I mean, if those that kind of preserve for humans the perception, but change the statistics of data, right? And to me, I think the next step is to really have the regulatory agencies take on these tests. I mean, we have a long way to go, because if you look at the NIST, which is the standards data sets for face recognition, that itself is heavily biased against minorities. But ultimately, the hope is regulatory agencies in each domain will be using these as tests. Especially for autonomous driving, this is a must, right? I mean, given the long tail, the only way to do is also have very heavy testing. It would need a lot of compute, but only then certify that this is roadworthy, and otherwise be very careful about that.
And Anima, to my understanding, NIST has been tasked to develop these AI standards. So they are especially working on those, given the example with the face recognition or computer vision data sets they had as well. So that was a great point that you identified. And again, there are all of these privacy enhancing or fairness enhancing adversarial applications of machine learning, but they might not be very common right now. But the most simplistic version we can think of is synthetically generating data to oversample minority populations so that we can improve their representation. Because at least in real world statistics, it's well known that oversampling minority groups is a helpful approach. But at the same time, again, this calls for the need of some standardization in this process. And again, this ties back into the question of, is only data biased or algorithms also biased? Why are we creating these algorithms? What are the goals of these algorithms? Who are the biased power holders implementing these algorithms? And again, so it really matters, and this might bring us to the Kant question here: should we have this deontological approach, or should we go with utilitarianism, and so on? So there are many interesting questions in this direction as well that we are starting to just scratch the surface nowadays, because it's becoming a very hot topic. So why are we even building these systems? Who are they going to empower at the end?
Absolutely. I just want to quickly add to Aylin's point on the oversampling for minorities. I think, if we don't have more data, I think that's a quick fix, right? That's a starting point. But that itself can also create problems, because GANs have mode collapse. So you just have very less diversity among, say, the minority class, right? For instance, in fact, it was shown when the images that are generated based on the celeb data set, the celebrity data set, Black women tended to have all with makeup on, right? So it was, and with these face recognition systems, when Black women didn't have makeup, it was even worse. So, so then there is kind of further bias even within the class because of the lack of diversity and variation. And that's why I think we need to disentangle all these factors and do unsupervised learning and learn. Is there also enough diversity within the class in terms of these variations?
Yeah, go ahead, Stella, sorry.
So that sort of feeds into something that someone in the Slack asked about as well, and that's been in the academic discussion of AI bias a lot recently, which is how models can exacerbate or create biases out of imperfections, either, even things that aren't normally thought of as imperfections, just the choice of your loss function implicitly decides how you're going to weigh different samples. And, this is crude, but if 90% of the people in a data set are white and 10% of the people in a data set are Black, then an algorithm that gets a little gain in performance at the cost of a little loss on a white person, at the cost of a little loss on a Black person, is going to perform better on average if it just mostly pays attention to white people. So, lost the rest of my train of thought, but so it's not just that when we talk about bias in algorithms, we're not just talking about the data coming in, but kind of algorithms can create their own sorts of little biases. And like, what does it look like to combat that? And kind of how does that happen? From the perspective of a data scientist who's looking at something, it's like, how do you know that's happening, and how do you combat that?
Just a quick anecdote, because I don't have an answer to your question, but a quick anecdote was one of the resume screening algorithms. It wasn't Amazon's, but it was like a different company's. When they reverse engineered it to see like why was it preferring men over women, one of the factors that they found, one of the strongest predictors was like the name. So if somebody was named Jared in particular, it was a very strong predictor of success, as well as if they were a lacrosse player or not on their resume. And so it was like just a sort of very interesting thing where, in a way, what happens there, like they're not even there considering, well, I don't know, I don't really know the model, but like, I don't think they were directly considering race or gender in that case. But if you look at those things, like Jared is a very white, like kind of Anglo name. Lacrosse is a very elite white sort of private school sport in the United States, despite the fact that it was invented by Native Americans actually. And so like those things sort of, they seep in and then they become these factors and they become predictive factors. But like behind those is always like, is race and gender and all of those things are like kind of still underlying. So.
Yep, these systems learn the associations, and you were both asking what kind of metrics we should, for example, develop to understand how to improve these systems. So I was wondering, maybe this exists in literature, but do we have, for example, diversity dispersion measurement metrics to understand how diverse a group is so that we can try to improve diversity within one social group? And then the other thing is, Stella, you mentioned objective functions or machine learning algorithms that are trying to optimize based on the data representation, where people are categorized into groups, racial groups or gender, and it's not even clear how ethical this approach is. Should people be represented in categories? Is this the correct proxy to a person's identity or being? And how should we deal with system design when we are developing new machine learning algorithms? Because each algorithm depends on these data types, the way they are represented, numeric values, ordinal, or whatever. And should we come up with more creative ways to design new algorithms for machine learning to counterbalance these problems?
And Stella, I mean, I'm going to reroute this question back to Catherine, because when I was reading a chapter from her book, Catherine, you spoke about like concepts which maintain power, like fairness, bias, and ethics. And you give this like amazing framework about concepts which challenge power. I didn't even think about that. Is that something you want to talk about? I feel it's a really cool framework for engineers to think beyond the fact framework that we're used to.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's in chapter one or two.
Yeah.
I can't remember. But yeah, I mean, so one of the things I think that Lauren and I were frustrated by is that we just felt like fairness, and this is not, I guess I should say a little bit of a disclaimer, because I actually think the work that's going on in the Fat Star community is super exciting. And so like, this is not to say that like no one should do that work, because I am really happy that work is being done. But that's just some of the organizing framing concepts for what we're talking about they don't go far enough. And so it's like, instead of fairness, we propose justice, or no, instead of ethics, we propose justice. Like, where we're really thinking about what does it mean to make a just system, which means repairing past harms. Like, harm has been done in the world. We come to the world in these bodies in which harm has been inflicted at the group level, for some of us for centuries, you know? And so like, how do we build systems that not only kind of treat us all equally as if we're all the same, but actually take that harm into account? And so we propose other concepts like justice, concepts like
My favorite one is collaboration.
That's what I was gonna say. Yeah, like kind of like, why settle for accountability? Because often accountability is after the fact, you know? Like, why can't we build systems that liberate us? Why can't we build systems that heal us? Like, I feel like we have the power to imagine just much more expansively. So like, it doesn't always have to be after the fact that we're trying to like, you know, repair things or whatever. We can really aspire to do much more. And so co-liberation means it's this idea that none of us are free until all of us are free. So we work with the most marginalized groups and center, like this is a case where we would like build a data set around whoever is most marginalized in whatever the application area is. And we would work with them directly, and they would be part of the process. And whatever is built, the system that is built, would like actively serve their needs in a really culturally grounded way, you know? And so I think that's totally feasible. It's just not the way that things are done right now.
I fully agree. I think these are great points, right? Ultimately, we have to kind of rework the whole framework. But I think to begin with, even, right, like the way these systems are now just kind of put out with almost no testing, right? And then only kind of somebody like kind of, right, brings up the problem, usually a minority researcher, and then the company is doing everything to push back and use all the resources to discredit the researcher. I think at least we should change that conversation, right? And I think that can happen, especially, you know, with the viewers of this panel. We need more hackers into these AI systems. Go hack every AI system out there, reveal all the vulnerabilities, you know, take it down, right? That's the only way we can then rebuild a new one.
Yeah, you can have like a brigade of like algorithmic bias assessors, whatever. I mean, like good trolls.
So to kind of move this towards, you know, advice or takeaways from the audience, because this has been a question popping up in the chat a lot, you know. So you guys are talking about how there's definitely steps that people can take to make progress in the way that they design their algorithms to be more inclusive and stuff like that. And one thing that kind of stood out to me as being implicitly present in a lot of what you guys said, but I don't think anyone said this explicitly, is that kind of the default view of AI is it's supposed to be descriptive. You take a description of the world as it was, and you put that through an algorithm, and the role of the algorithm is to make the future look like the past. And so in a very real sense, AI is intrinsically regressive. But at the same time, there's nobody saying you have to do that. You know, you can decide that you want to choose to value certain things more than others, and you want to kind of bring about certain impacts, and you can proscriptively put those into your algorithms. Personally, I have tried to advocate for this, and largely speaking failed, because people are scandalized by the idea that you might tell the data how it's supposed to look. But you know, so if you're a data scientist or a machine learning research engineer listening to this chat, you know, how can they proscriptively design their algorithms for equity, for justice, for liberation, for whatever all these very nice words are, that are better than bias or fairness, I suppose. You know, what does that look like to design an algorithm in that fashion?
I mean, I'll start and then hopefully others can build. But like, I mean, I think what it would look like is to really think about where what your work is doing is being applied and on whom, right? And like who you're making it for, like who's your boss, and then like who are ultimately like the end users or who is kind of impacted, who are the decisions being made about because of the system, and to do basically like a power analysis of that system. And then think about what is the history of that domain area, what's the history of that application area, who has been systematically disenfranchised, and then work with the groups who are working towards a better future in that domain to co-create like what the metrics should be for the future. You know, I mean, I think that we're not asking, I don't think it's like appropriate that like a machine learning engineer would like invent the metrics out of their head or something, you know what I mean? Like in a domain space they may not know very much about, but I think it is feasible that like a company could work really well with a group of folks, say working on prison abolition or something like that, and could craft like, here are the metrics for what the world that we would like to see, and this is like the kind of outcomes that we want to see. And so that would be my kind of generalized recommendation. But that said, and this is why I think is one of the major tensions of this space, is that often people are building tools that are more generic, right? Like you're looking for generalizability, you're looking for abstraction, and like that could be applied in a wide variety of different application domains. And that I think is a tension. I actually think that is like a major tension for AI doing good in the world and being culturally grounded and informed. And I don't know how to resolve that. And I would love to hear what like the computer scientists and researchers have to say about if they see that tension as well or not.
I fully agree. And I think to me that foundations of that goes back to the education, right? So computer science and engineering has had the military background. You know, it started as a way to, right, get into the military, and that's there today. Like, you know, we are told to keep our emotions aside. In fact, that was a lot of gaslighting on Twitter is about, oh, why are we emotionally charged about machine learning? Just focus on the math, you know. And so that's something that's pervasive in the educational system and then beyond in the companies, right? Like, you don't worry about this, you do, you know, you derive math, you just, you know, program. So you're asked to become a robot without any emotions. And I think that's just really dangerous, right? Because it's not every engineer who's the problem. I mean, there's absolutely a decision maker who's probably, right, kind of you know, may or may not understand the implications, but is kind of directing all this and leading to the pervasive bias and injustice. I think we have to start with education. That's where I would pin my hopes. For instance, at Caltech, we have a course on ethics for AI. I think every university is now doing that. Ultimately, more humanistic education. You know, we are kind of, you know, I went to technical school, now I'm in a technical school, right? The role of humanities there needs to be even further emphasized. You know, it's much better than when I went to school, but it's still a long way to go to integrate humanities and engineering together.
I completely agree with Anima. I'm also teaching bias in AI. I think it needs to be part of the curriculum, not for computer scientists only, but also engineers, humanities, social scientists probably as well, because data scientists or essentially anyone that is interested in computing is using these tools. So they need to understand that all of these tools exist within a context. They don't just exist in an abstract, generalizable way, as Catherine mentioned. It's correct that these tools or algorithms were developed so that they can be applied to hypothetical data sets, so that the theory or foundations are presented. But then when we take social data and apply these tools for machine learning tasks in the social domain, then we are dealing with all kinds of human complications. So people need to always keep in mind that these systems, yes, they might look objective and neutral, but they are not in the social context because they exist with all the problems or side effects that human decision making brings into the game. But moreover, AI also brings its own kinds of problems, such as new types of biases we are not even aware of yet. And these keep getting amplified in society. So before we start introducing more of those, we need to understand what we are bringing to the world and what we should be careful about, because all of these systems are deployed right now without understanding what side effects they might have, or what the implications are on society, economy, democracy, and so on. And now we would need to deal with all of these consequences on top of all the other things.
It seems like a major takeaway you guys all advocate for is to kind of broaden the scope of who gets included in the conversation about AI design, about AI data collection, bringing in activists in the relevant spaces, bringing in other stakeholders. And one thing that I would like to add to that is that the notion of stakeholder is really politically fraught. In industry contexts, stakeholders are generally conceived of as like, let's suppose I'm at a ML company developing an algorithm that I'm going to sell to another company to use for financial profit. The stakeholders in this process are generally conceived as being me and my team, my superiors at my company, the people I'm selling the algorithm to, and the stockholders of their company. And that, I think that misses a really crucial point, which is the stakeholders are the people whose data is going to be analyzed. And their voice is very, very frequently just completely left out of any discussion about how things are designed, why things are designed, and where they come from. And I mean, to an extent, that's partially by design, because a lot of companies exist out of the fact, because of the fact that they can make money analyzing user data. Like that's their sole reason, that's their reason for existing. There are lots of these companies. But broadening the notion of a stakeholder, in particular viewing anyone whose data is going to be processed by an AI as a stakeholder, is really important.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. We have a chapter in our book which is about the principle embrace pluralism, which is basically this idea that we create more complete knowledge. Like the path to objectivity is not through individual genius, but it's through bringing multiple different perspectives to the table. But I agree with you. I think it's important to think about because we can say, oh, it was participatory, that company with all the money and the other company with all the money both participated. Right? So I do think, and this is because participation, I mean, there's this whole world, participatory design and participatory methods. And so there's even folks have talked about participation washing, where you're like, oh yeah, we did this also happens in urban planning, like, oh yeah, we did a public meeting and it was at 10 p.m. and there was no childcare, but so what's the quality and the character of the participation? Who shows up? Who are these stakeholders? And who are the stakeholders that are not convenient to have? I mean, and how do you make folks listen to them? I mean, I think that's a big question, when ultimately the goal is to optimize profit. That to me is a conundrum.
That's a great point.
I think how do you make people listen, I think, is a really interesting question. A lot of people, I imagine a lot of people feel like they would like to do something good. They would like to be more just and do their design the right way. But how do you convince your boss or your boss's boss, who controls the money and the funding, or the money and the decision-making power, and who's maybe more interested in what's profitable? How do any of you guys have advice about how to approach that conversation? Or how to advocate for justice in AI design in contexts where that input is not necessarily the primary concern of the people who pull the strings?
I'm interested in that as a research question. If we can figure out a way to simulate AI systems to show their long-term gains and losses for all the parties that are involved, I think we would be able to understand how this affects economy from various perspectives. But again, this is a hypothetical research question. I'm sure there is already some great research on this yet, but maybe long-term goals might be able to convince people that are profit-driven as well.
I mean, especially if there's concerns, I really like that idea a lot, especially if there's concerns. I mean, as there's this growing sort of industry of sort of impact assessment or algorithmic bias assessment and things like this. This is like bringing folks in and doing a more participatory design process is a preventative for what could happen later, you know? And so I think maybe that's like if the case needs to be economic rather than moral. I mean, you can make the moral case, but probably what they'll listen to is the economic case, right? But if the case needs to be economic, I think that, you know, it would be lovely to have some quantifiable research that you could cite to say that, like, yeah, there's this like very strong economic case that this will reduce the number of lawsuits later, you know, that you'll be fully compliant with all federal regulations, that, you know what I mean, like this, these kinds of things. I think that might be the path for convincing the employers and like ultimately, like you've invested in prevention so that you don't have to clean up a big mess after the fact.
I think that's why academia and the independent researchers have such an important role, right? Because they can talk openly about these issues, like, you know, what happened with the gender shade studies, right? Even though internally there was a lot of conversation at Amazon when I was there, you know, having that external light into it and then the wider public participating in it, I think is critical. Because, you know, like being in these companies, it's just the whole system is so short-term driven, right? The Wall Street expects quarterly results. If that's not delivered, the company won't even exist, right? So the whole system is not built for the long-term implications. And I think that's what creates these challenges. And so somehow maybe then having more participation from the public, right, can show that also, you know, bad AI can lead to bad PR and loss of profits even in the short term. I think that activism and awareness is critical to change this.
Ram, you want to jump in?
Oh yeah, I was just framing about what Anima said, but the way I think about this is, at least again through lived experience, I can say that what has changed for me is that if you think of like inclusion as after the fact, that's kind of like really weird. One of the things that I am very lucky is that inclusion is part of my core priorities that I set. Like, it's just not for me, it's for everybody in the company. Like, you've got to set that, what is your inclusion priority? For me, it might be like, you know, I'm going to take care of Pride Month, like, you know, talks, or, you know, whatever things, right? So obviously it doesn't solve all problems. So first of all, I fundamentally believe that if your organization is questioning why you're doing something ethical, that itself is a big red flag for me, right? Like, and for the business case, I do agree, like, you know, there's this, like, you know, how Catherine said there could be some financial motivation. I saw like an HBR article about like how diversity leads to more surplus because you're selling your product to more people. That could be like another way. The PR angle, like, I mean, everybody's afraid of like bad marketing. I never actually thought about that, so thanks for bringing that up. But for me, intrinsically, you know, I have never been told you can't publish this. I mean, but again, it's a very different setting, like MSR, and like, you know, the product setting is very different. But yeah, I would be very uncomfortable if I have to make a case to my manager as to why I'm doing something ethical in the first place. But like Anima pointed out, like business, I've only worked in one organization for like my working life. I do not know how others operate. I know some of the CEOs out there question why they should use pronouns. So, or like why they should, like, you know, why they do not like fundamentally care about democracy and just want to dismantle it. So I don't know. I do not know how things work there. From my lived experience, I don't know if this might actually be helpful for others.
All right, so it seems like the kind of two major points you guys have raised is that you can view it as a risk mitigation factor, because it will stop things from, it can stop things from going wrong in the future, and it's in some sense insurance on that. And it's also a PR thing, which is partially a risk mitigation factor, because you really don't want the New York Times running an article saying so-and-so's company develops algorithm that systematically discriminates against women in hiring.
Oh, I actually saw a really
bad headline. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I actually saw Anima. I only saw it through your tweet about Genderify. or Genderify.
Genderify.
You want to talk about that? I found it so weird.
Yeah, and I think after all the outcry, it got withdrawn, right? The fact that it even got launched is just appalling, the kind of lack of awareness in these companies.
Yeah, it was shocking. You know, there was another company, I don't know who alerted me to it, but essentially like their solution for more representation on stock photos was to kind of like artificially generate like photos using GANs. So you will not actually pay money to hire a Black model. Oh, let's just use Style GAN and like to kind of like, you know, fill diversity. I'm like, how do you get through like, who's funding this? And goes back to Anima's like initial comment about VCs getting excited. So that I feel is a bigger like thing. I would be very less worried about managers and more worried about like plutocratic like Silicon Valley folks than like actually managers.
So to kind of contextualize this for people who in the audience who aren't aware, Genderify is a product that existed for all of about 4 hours before they shut it down out of the massive outcry. What their business model was that you can send them user data, you can send them photos, you can send them people's names, and they will they say they will determine the gender of the people that you that you sell to, or the people that are in your data set, with an aim of doing better predictive marketing and stuff based on the I'm having trouble coming up with a word other than assumed gender of the people in your data set. And this was funded by some VCs, and it went online, and everybody, including lots of people in the ML space who don't really care very much, who don't talk very much publicly about ML bias, lost their shit because it was a completely absurd idea.
And just to give an example, right, the word professor was only 1.9% females. So that's the assigned percentage for me in terms of gender. So I think that was the problematic thing. Like, how could you just type any name, like any word, not just name, right? Any word in the vocabulary and assign a gender to that. I mean, and only binary genders, right? It's just appalling, the whole concept.
Yeah, my friend was saying the only time that's allowed, it's in French. Any other language, like, you know, because, you know, nouns have gender. Any other time, table doesn't have like a male or female. Yes. Anyway.
Yeah, but I'll note that like there are, like this product is insane, but there are other products. Like there's all these gender detection libraries out there, both for faces, so like facial detection, which the researcher Oz Keys has written this amazing paper called Misrecognition Machines, which is about how harmful face, like gender detection of faces is for trans folks. But then there's also all sorts of libraries that infer gender from name using various kinds of like name databases. And like, maybe I'll be like sort of a naysayer here, because like in general, I feel like these applications are very, well, again, it depends on the application domain. So like if you're doing this for predictive marketing, or like Oz talks about how they're doing it for bathroom access, which is like disgusting, you know, like, are you the right gender to get into this bathroom or whatever? Those are super harmful and awful, and like those kind of applications shouldn't exist. And yet at the same time, these gender detection libraries are helpful for doing like bibliometric studies, where you're looking across like a huge corpus of, say, like, I don't know, like several million authors, and trying to see like what's the overrepresentation of men in that data set or something like that, you know? And so like that's why, like, again, I think it's hard to just say categorically something is bad or good, although I do have certain things that I do think that way about, but like that could enable really interesting research that monitors back on the patriarchy, for example. And so like, again, it's like, who's using it for what, who's benefiting? Yeah, like that's what matters, you know.
And just to give an example, we have used the gender detector, but that was to learn about the Me Too conversation. So we collected lots of Me Too data from Twitter, and how are men talking about it? How are women talking about it? Right? The interaction, how are Democrats, Republicans? So so in that kind of, and this is in collaboration with professor in sociology, Mike Alvarez. So, the context certainly matters. We can't just ban all applications of gender detection, but really contextualize and look at whether it's for harm or for good.
Yeah.
And in medical applications, we especially need very accurate biased representations, because we know that for certain disease, the diagnosis and prognosis depends on ethnic factors, gender, and socioeconomic background as well. Of course, there are biases representing injustices in these medical data sets, but at the same time, there are biases that we need to learn from for more accurate medical treatment. And I guess that's why, for example, in the medical domain, machine decision making is becoming much more accurate than human decision making. But again, yet we need to deal with all the other disadvantages that come with this. So again, I guess everyone keeps mentioning this. It really depends on the context where we are using these things. And name-based gender detection is a kind of an outrageous example, but then there is a supercharged version of this in country X, where machine learning is used to predict the criminality of a person from their face, or actually give people social scores so that they can be sent to workers' camps for their entire lives because the machine said so. So there's a spectrum of these effects that we can discuss, and then what foundations should we be building on, given these examples that already exist in the world.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I completely dismissed it, Catherine, and thank you, Anima and Aylin, for correcting this. Thank you.
I didn't mean to correct anything, by the way. I was.
Oh no, it was like, I learned something. So thanks for telling me about this. Yes, I appreciate it.
What did you learn, Ram? Can you?
Well, I just completely dismissed like gender detection. I was like, oh, this is like has literally no use. If I want to ask somebody's gender, I will just ask them if it's part of my business. Else, it's none of my business. I'm not gonna ask. But when Anima spoke about like the hashtag Me Too movement, I was like, okay, that kind of makes sense. And when Aylin spoke about it in the medical context, that makes sense. So yeah, this was, like I said, I already learned something from this panel, and within like 2 more minutes for the panel to get over, I learned something. I learned a lot of things.
The example that Aylin brought up of criminality prediction is unfortunately running rampant in the AI literature right now. I feel like there's a half dozen papers that have been published and then promptly retracted after a massive public outcry, because they're basically trying to like reinvent phrenology, but doing it with machine learning, and therefore it's good. There's a whole lot that could be said about this that could and actually almost was its own panel at DEFCON. But there's a really good paper on this called Criminality from Facial Illusion, which I'll send out on Discord and on Twitch to people who are interested in reading about this problem, that does a really good job of picking apart a lot of the issues with, and both morally and also technologically, because a lot of these papers are fundamentally technologically unsound with these kinds of works. So we're approaching an hour and a half. This is our last event of the day. I'm enjoying talking to you guys a lot. I don't know if you have somewhere you need to be, but I understand that. But I would, if you guys are interested in continuing to talk, I am more than happy to do so.
I have to go make dinner for my family.
I have like an ask.
Joining us, Catherine.
And it's actually sunny for a very short period of time in Seattle. So
Yay!
try to sneak in like a run, Stella. Stella, before we all disperse, I first want to thank you so much for organizing this. You have put so much thought and intention into this. Like, I remember like asking you like, hey, I don't want to be the male in this. Like, you know, have you thought about, you know, inclusive panel? I don't want to be a male. You wrote like perhaps the most comprehensive male, you know, about this. So thank you so much for, you know, moving with intention, Stella. It clearly shows when you organize this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Second.
Thank you. This was amazing. I learned so much, and it's great to connect with all of you. And thanks, Stella.
Yeah, I enjoyed discussing with all of you. I think this was productive, and now I have more research ideas that I can go back and work on.
So quickly before you guys run, I want to take advantage of the fact that I have several experts here to get your thoughts on something I've been working on recently, which is we've almost touched on this several times, and it's that a lot of times machine learning algorithms have a underlying ontology. So Catherine mentioned, you know, that some gender algorithms exclude transgender people, you know, but even when you're talking about like all sorts of other applications, you know, I work a lot with US government data scientists. And so they're working with data sets that come from the US Census. And the US Census is a very specific notion of what race is. And there isn't an option to use anything else because you're the US government and you're using US Census data. But kind of how you define your categories, you know, how you choose who gets labeled as white, who gets labeled as Asian, really makes a big impact on what your algorithm does and how it behaves, and whether you include certain categories. You know, if you include transgender people or not. You know, if non-binary transgender people who don't identify as a man or as a woman is not a possible label, then you have a guaranteed 100% incorrect assignment rate for them. So, you know, do you have any thoughts or advice about how to kind of tackle, you know, how to approach this problem? Obviously, originally we can go and talk to the impacted communities and try to figure out what the right buckets are. But oftentimes we start from a position where our data has been pre-collected for us by someone else. And so if you have data that has this kind of problem in the way the questions were asked originally, you know, is there something you can do with it still?
I think that's a great question, right? And a difficult one because, you know, the systems are already built, like you were saying, the categories are there, this is the label data. So I think towards getting to solutions for this, I think an important step is being able to trust the system in terms of confidence levels, right? Like, can the system say truly how confident it is? And the standard neural networks don't have this property. So it can make high confidence errors. You know, it can be like 95% confident and be wrong, right? And that especially happens on these kind of hard examples, which hasn't seen in training data because it also gets the calibration wrong. So in one of our papers, we call it angular visual hardness. We proposed a new angular measure for detecting these hard examples that was more robust than the standard accuracy scores and the confidence scores that the systems are built on. And we also have some mathematical intuitions for that. But the outcome of this is we can now look at you know, examples which are hard for the current classifier, right? So in this gender detection example, it would be most likely the transgender people who would fall as hard examples because it's not getting this accurate, right? No matter what binary gender the person is assigned to, and if they don't kind of, you know, display that gender, right? So there is that issue that can be detected through these mathematical means. And then I think at least there is now the problem that has come up, right? That not every example is equally treated, and there are hard examples for this classifier. We can go back and then design a system to correct that.
And on a related note, I will give a vague answer to this before I actually ask even more daunting or deeper question. Maybe Anima's, for example, idea of using more unsupervised approaches might be some kind of a solution for future generations of AI algorithms. Maybe you wouldn't need to categorize yourself as a person, but instead some kind of more unsupervised continuous representation of social entities might be a way to approach this problem. This is not going to happen anytime soon, so I don't really have an answer for today's problems, because we know that gender is reflected to other features, all other features as proxies as well, because when we think about gender, that's the largest social group in society, so it's one of the biggest proxies in data sets. But my more concerning question is semantics. Gender and race is defined in categories, so it's a proxy, but when you think about it, essentially race doesn't really exist, or gender might not even exist, but we have it in our language, in our linguistic system, and that's the way we are constructed to deal with the world. So how are we going to change these problems that are social constructs in AI systems that we are building on these social constructs? So it's a longer term problem that might require longer term solutions, which might not be very helpful for your question.
Yeah, that really gets at something unfortunate in that a lot of people in like the Discord are asking applied questions that I haven't raised because they know that the answer is we don't know how to do that. We would love to know how to do that too. So one example question is, if you can't bring in experts or social scientists or stakeholders, is there an algorithmic way to kind of pick up on the bias? And the answer is, well, there's 50 and we don't know which ones work better in different contexts.
I mean, but there is an algorithmic way to educate yourself, and that's like search engines, right?
That's what?
That's like, that could be search engines. Just like, go type like, if you want to learn about bias, go read Aylin's papers. If you want to learn about like, bias, go watch like Timnit Goodbrew's like workshops. So I think a lot of this hands-on things, smart people have already put out content, and it's just like a matter for us to spend like cycles to educate ourselves on.
Yeah, and as a like very basic kind of check, like you can look at the output of your system if it has to do with people, and just look across intersectional groups. So like you do, like assuming that you have gender data and race data, maybe you have income data, or maybe you have age, or maybe you have like some other kinds of, dimensions that describe people, is just looking at disparate outcomes within each thing and then combining those in various different ways to see if there are disparate outcomes amongst the categories. Because like the theory of intersectionality from Black feminism says that like these categories compound in like a nonlinear way, right? So experiencing sexism as a white woman is fundamentally very different from experiencing sexism and racism as a Black woman. So I mean, I think that's a very basic kind of self-audit that you can do when you're working with data that's about people, that like you don't need all that much like special training necessarily. But I mean, I think other people are working on this, right? I mean, I feel like you guys would know this better than me, but like folks have been working on things like where you would substitute out, like you do like a sort of counterfactual, and you look at, well, what if this data point, like they had this outcome, but what if their race had been white? Would they have had the same outcome with my system? So I think people are working on those kinds of methods. But I think just a really basic one is just do a kind of a intersectional audit.
Well, Stella, I, for one, look forward to reading your work when it comes out.
Thank you so much for joining. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We've gone horribly over, but I've had a wonderful time talking to all of you, and I know that the people listening really enjoyed it. If anyone wants to continue this conversation who's listening, if you head over to the DEFCON Discord, there's a voice channel where I'm happy to continue to talk to anyone who wants to ask questions or get references to papers that people brought up and such. Thank you again to all of our wonderful panelists. This has been amazing, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful to talk with all of you. All right.